Thanks for joining us today for our Public Service Perspectives presentation with Craig Butler. Before I turn it over to him, I do just want to remind everyone of our usual housekeeping business. Please ensure that your microphone is muted so that we can avoid any disruptions during his presentation, but you can communicate freely throughout the chat if you'd like. You can also drop your questions in the chat, or you can use the raise your hand feature to ask questions at the end. We'll just unmute you and you can ask aloud. While Craig is screen sharing, I do recommend you set your video layout to side-by-side mode. You will just click the view options at the top right corner of your Zoom and select side-by-side. And you can switch back to active speaker or gallery view after he's done screen sharing. The last thing to note is we are recording this session to make it available for others after today. Before we get started, if anyone has any announcements or anything to share with the group, I'll welcome you to go ahead and do that. I will go ahead and be the first to share. We have a lot of events coming up to wrap up the end of this school year. We have the Ohio University Music Industry Summit next Thursday, March 25th, as well as 2 more public service perspectives presentations. We will have one the last day of March, March 31st, with 3 Voinovich students, and then we will have Danny Twilley coming in on April the 7th. So save the date for those.
Sure, if Lorraine is on here, but I also wanted to make sure that folks know that there is a sustainability film series panel tonight at 7. It's a great film, and people can still sign up to see it and then join the panel.
Thanks, Natalie. Any other news or updates to share? Okay. Well, I will go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Jeff DeBelko to introduce our speaker, Craig Butler. Thanks, everyone.
Terrific. Thank you, Mackenzie. Greetings, everyone. Jeff DeBelko, professor here at the Voinovich School. It's terrific to see current students, former students, and alums, colleagues here in Athens and around the state and around the country tuning in to hear Craig Butler, who's also an alum, but has never really left us at Ohio University. He's been so active and so present in the university and sharing his insights and drawing on insights from people at the university in the work that he's done in a variety of positions that really places him well to speak to us and share some of those insights and lessons learned. Today, he's framed it as Lake Erie, solving complex environmental challenges through science and collaboration. Craig has been in positions where he's constantly taking in the science, trying to apply it to problems, working with internal and external partners. That's not always easy, but we're certain that we'll kind of gain the insights of how to do that as we both try to learn it and practice it ourselves at the Voinovich School that's so committed to that engaged learning and making an impact in communities. So Craig is currently the Executive Director and Secretary for the Muskingum Watershed Conservancy District and has been playing that role since May 1st of last year. He's also has been the Executive Director of the Power Siting Board for the Public Utilities Commission of Ohio. Notably, he served as Director of the Ohio Environmental Protection Agency. And in that role, I know had all sorts of challenges in balancing science and decision-making and bringing those things together with competing interests. And so I think we'll hear a bit about that, to say the least, in the context of this Lake Erie challenge. So Craig, let's throw it over to you and really look forward to this discussion that so directly ties into our public administration program, our environmental studies program, and our new Masters in Sustainability, Security, and Resilience program. So it's a thrill to have you here, Craig.
Jeff, thank you. Thrills all mine for sure. So to Dean Weinberg, Jeff, to you, and to Mackenzie, thank you for helping to set this up. I'm really pleased to do it. You know, when I was asked to do this, it was about the role of science in policymaking and looking at complex challenges through collaboration. And I was looking for a way to do that using just some past experience, kind of as, in the adaptive learning process. So I immediately thought, one of the longest protracted issues that we have worked with when I was director of the Ohio EPA, and that we still are working on, frankly, and we'll go through this, is, how do we manage Lake Erie as the crown jewel of the state of Ohio, as it's often called? A lot of people, affiliate with the lake, particularly folks that live and around the lake, much like I do, and many folks in Athens gravitate to Appalachia and become have very much an affinity with that. Many people along Lake Erie, or even in Ohio, one of the first things that they have and talk about in defining why and where they are from is using Lake Erie as an example. So Lake Erie is a really complex system, and before we jump into that, I thought I'd just share with you a little bit of an outline of what I thought I would cover. So I'm going to share it's like a 30-second video, and it's if you harken back to not just the immediate past issues we've had with Lake Erie, but if you take a little broader, holistic, long-term issue in Lake Erie, there's certainly some that are on the presentation today that remember back into the late 60s, or even a little bit before that, into the 70s, when Lake Erie was declared dead. And I want to talk about some of the science that was applied and some of the processes and resources that were applied to make sure that we brought that back. It's really one of the greatest ecological success stories that we had. Some background on Lake Erie and history of that transformation, but then a real cautionary tale is, through the 90s, what was happening to Lake Erie and water quality in the 90s, and then what became very relevant in the 2000s, 2010, and even concurring today. And then how have we responded today, looking and using at the science, how policymakers responded. And then the question about, are we succeeding? I think it's still an open question, but one that deserves, I guess, just some discussion around how the policy was shaped using science and whether or not we were successful or failure. I often talk about adaptive management, both in a science perspective, but also from a policy perspective. I often will say it's like kind of building an airplane when you go down the runway. You're never going to have all the answers, but you try to get the best science and information as you can. And then you're left as a policymaker needing to make some judgments based on the best information and science that you have at the time. So if I can get this to work, I think I can. I'll play just a short little clip of about Lake Erie.
Craig, is there sound to this video?
There should be. Let's see if I can.
We will need to reformat your settings here. I apologize. I wasn't aware you had a video to share.
Okay.
We're gonna take a quick moment to brief, guys, if you all want to take a bathroom break or get some water. Craig, if you will end your screen share.
Oh, this is about 30 seconds. You want me just to keep going?
That's fine. That works.
Okay.
I didn't know if you needed the sound. We have to do a quick little checkbox to allow for sound to come through a PowerPoint. No worries.
I think it's instructive enough. We can just take a look at these next couple of photos. Really, it was just talking about, is Lake Erie dead? Lake Erie was in fact declared dead by the state health department in the late 60s. Poster child certainly for the environmental movement. It was facing new critical challenge, but if you think about, I call it, is it an abusive relationship that we've had with Lake Erie? We certainly asked a lot of this ecosystem to provide, and it certainly has provided, but we've also not maintained it as much as we have. You can see the screenshot on the left, that's the Cuyahoga River as it comes down into the basin, into Lake Erie, and you can just see on any given day, you could tell basically who was operating in an industrial perspective by looking at what color the river was. Whether it was pickle liquor, or whether it was grease or oil, whether it was spent chemicals, you could really get a sense just by the different colorations of the river. So Lake Erie, not just from Cleveland, but the whole Western Basin and large parts of the lake were in fact declared dead from an ecological perspective. The one on the right is particularly interesting to me. It's kind of a old versus new picture. It's a picture in the late 60s, pieces along the Cuyahoga River where you can see they've just taken old junk cars, lined the river with the old cars for erosion. So did they have the right idea in mind about stopping erosion? Yes. Were they really off base in terms of how they do it? Absolutely. And you can see beyond that, if you took that picture away, you can see how that restoration effort has gone forward. But, I think to the point, there's two things I'll make a point here that, the Cuyahoga River and the burning of the Cuyahoga River in 1969 was really a bellwether, and I'll talk about for a few reasons, but it wasn't the first. In fact, it had burned over 13 times in the 100 years prior to that. It certainly wasn't the worst. The largest was in 1954, where in terms of loss of economics and money, and it certainly wasn't, we didn't have a loss of life in 69, but back in the 40s, there was a fire where 5 people were injured and killed from fires that had preceded the 1969 fire. The question is it an abusive relationship? And at the time, you know, you think you're somewhat appalled when we look at the the videos that you can find ad nauseum online or in the history books, and looking at the way we treated Lake Erie. But if you go back and talk to a couple of and look at some writings of David and Richard Stradling, who are 2 historians, environmental historians, and they had this really interesting quote about this abusive relationship. And they said, far too many problems plagued the city of Cleveland for residents to get hung up on a little fire. It didn't represent a culmination or an abusive relationship per se. It was just another sad chapter in a long story of a terribly polluted river. And so they almost just shrugged their shoulders a little bit and said, you know, no big deal. And so, you know, just life kind of moved on. However, I'm going to switch gears and just take for a second to talk to you about Lake Erie in particular, and land use. And it's going to be instructive as we go further through the presentation later on, particularly when we're looking at using science to deter some of the threats. When you look at all of the Great Lakes, there's a kind of 3 words that I would say. Lake Erie it's the shallowest, it's the warmest, and the most nutrient rich of all of the Great Lakes. And that's just partly by geology, geography, and also human input, particularly on the nutrient enrichment side of things. And as you can see, we're first in the number of residents. There's a population both between US and Canada, about 34 million people that live in the watershed, supplies drinking water to 11 million people. It is, you know, least in terms of forest land, and in brushland wetlands. You can see agriculture is number 1 as well. You can see it's a heavily modified and a heavily used and impacted watershed around Lake Erie. But it's also one of the best fisheries in the world, and also one of the best ecosystems as well. So I'm going to go through some other statistics here. It's the most productive fishery of all of the Great Lakes. There's a statistic that Dr. Jeff Reuter uses that I love to parrot. It's not exact, as he says, but it is instructive. If you think about Lake Superior has 50% of the water of all of the Great Lakes, 2% of the species of fish. Lake Erie has 2% of the water of all of the Great Lakes and 50% of the fish. So you can get a sense about how nutrient rich, from a good way, that fishery is. Considered the walleye capital of the world. And this is just since the recovery from the early degradation in the 1960s. You know, as we went into the 70s and 80s and 90s, walleye loved this environment, shallow, warm water, nutrient rich. As they had been introduced, they have certainly taken off. It's a world-class fishery. We've got over 300 marinas. As you can see, we've also got 40% of all the Great Lakes charter boats. Charter boat industry is about $1.5 billion sport fishing industry, and tourism value just continues to go up. That value is just a little bit old. It's about $12.9 billion from a calculated economics. So just think about where we started just a few slides ago, where we were looking at the Cuyahoga River, burning the Cuyahoga River, and the declaration that Lake Erie was dead from a eutrophication standpoint, to, frankly, to where we are today. And as you can see, I talk about the recovery and how much of a significant recovery the ecosystem has made just in a very short period of time. And this is my Fred Flintstone graphic here. It's like, but wait a minute, I thought Lake Erie was dead, and what has happened? And I've talked a little about that, but I want to go into a little bit more detail. As I said, it's one of the most one of the best ecosystem recoveries in the world. And it didn't just happen without lots of, I think, incentives, as well as there are some external drivers that we want to talk about. So a confluence of several national and local factors. So Cuyahoga fire was certainly one, but as I mentioned before, it had burned in the past. And as the environmental historians had said, it really wasn't that big a deal. It's more of just a another factor in daily life going on in Cleveland, Ohio, that the Cuyahoga River catches on fire. It was not given much of a second thought by most. But at the time, against this confluence, there was a Cleveland mayoral election that was taking place. And it was the first time in 1969 that Cleveland had actually elected a Black mayor, which was instructive and helpful. There was many of you studied, as you have gone through your environmental science courses, I call it the budding environmental awareness in the late 60s. Generation was really starting to take a look at how we were mechanizing, industrializing, and looking at the ramifications of that since post-World War II, and seeing that there were environmental challenges and impacts to human health that really needed to be addressed. But I think one of the greatest things was the August 1st, 1969 Time magazine. On it was the picture of the Kennedy, Kopechne, Chappaquiddick political issue of the time, but it also was the Neil Armstrong walking on the moon version, and inside was Lake Erie, pictures of Lake Erie burning in 1969. And so not only was the Lake Erie burning issue brought prominently to a national issue, but it was also on one of the most widely sold magazine covers in the time. And so it really brought a national prominence to the issue. And this is one of those things, if you take a broad look and make a broad generalization here, the idea about science informing policy and or when and how it can do that, sometimes it needs a trigger. I consider that this is really the trigger where it was really an issue that was affecting more than just a small number of people, but it was affecting either the conscience of the nation or a large number of people in a very large way, where they then started asking questions and demanding answers and demanding some action. So I think this idea, where's the outcry? And then when does that outcry disappear? Is it an issue of the day that goes away? Or is it an issue that really brings policy leaders to change their focus on whatever that other crisis they'd been working on and focus on whatever this issue is today and start looking for solutions or answers? I use a generalization when I talk with the General Assembly, legislatures, and others about this, when we were talking about any particular environmental issue. The general public, in my view, is a broad generalization. We've all got a full plate of issues to worry about every day. We've got to take care of our kids. We've got to take care of our family. We've got to worry about our house. Got to walk the dog. We got to do whatever it is that is on our plate for the day. The last thing we want is to wake up, look out the window, and see metaphorically, and see some environmental threat that I need to now put on my plate and worry about. Are my kids going to be safe? Can I drink the water? Can we go to the beach today? Can I breathe the air? When those types of issues get put in the public's things that they have to worry about during any particular day, that's when you start getting enough momentum, in my view, where they really start demanding something of their public policy leaders. They can't just forget about it. It's not going to go away. And they really start driving the issue about trying to find out what the science is telling us is going on and what the solution is, how we monitor for that and put solutions in place. So broad generalization, and this will be a theme as we go through it, but I think what's the trigger? We've got triggers all over the place that would want to capture our attention about things that are going well or going bad that we need to pay attention and focus on. But this is the trigger here that I say, the confluence of events. And we're going to see another one in this Lake Erie story as we go forward. But there was once we captured the collective policymakers' attention around Lake Erie, there were a couple of really significant events that happened. So the US and Canada moved very quickly to develop agencies and policies to kind of quote unquote fix the problem. The two that are really noteworthy are the US Environmental Protection Agency and then what is now called Environment Canada. There were others, states started forming their environmental agencies like Ohio EPA. We also had, this was kind of the great age, if you will, of large national environmental statutes. So we saw NOAA and the Fisheries Commission in particular around this issue. But the two I'm going to talk about as we go further, one is the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, and then the interplay between the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement and the Clean Water Act, which was also passed during this time. So maybe another broad generalization here, but if you look at the problems that Lake Erie was facing in the late 60s, and then the status of the science, which was really emerging at the time, there were really some visible threats. You look back at the pictures we showed a little bit earlier, water coming down Cuyahoga River, red as could be, probably coming out of one of the steel mills as pickle liquor. As you look at wastewater discharges from wastewater treatment plants at the time, generally unregulated or doing some minimal treatment, dumping virtually untreated or partially treated wastewater into Lake Erie. In some cases in Cleveland, right adjacent to Edgewater Beach. And that was the little video clip I was going to show you. Is they were talking about in late 1969 and 1970s, Edgewater Beach, which is now run by the Cleveland Metro Parks, but was also run by the state of Ohio as a state park. They wouldn't let anybody in the water until they put basically a plastic curtain on the outside around Edgewater Beach and then chlorinated the water, because the wastewater treatment plant discharge was within 30 feet of Edgewater Beach. And so there were some obvious, really interesting vector issues there that were impacting the public. And they finally started to realize people are getting sick because we got untreated sewage going into Edgewater Beach right next to on Lake Erie. So there really some visible threats, unregulated minimally discharges from wastewater and municipal wastewater treatment, no stormwater controls for runoff. And then if you're back out into the watershed, we talk about agricultural practices. Basically, we had still practicing general moldboard plowed tillage, as well as really unregulated, quote unquote, or really no policy driven or science driven application of fertilizer. There wasn't at the time to go to the Soil and Water Extension Agency, Soil and Water Commission, do some soil testing, see what fertilizer you had remaining, particularly phosphorus in the soil from one year to another, do some strategic implementation of phosphorus and nitrogen application. It was, I'm doing what I've done for generations because I can't risk not having the same success that I had in the past in terms of crops with nutrients. So there's mass over application of fertilizers and nutrient enrichments. Ironically enough, algal blooms were something of the day in the 60s and 70s and 80s. There is a photo that I don't think I included in here. Dr. Jeff Reuter from Stone Lab at Ohio State, 1971. He's taken a photo of himself with his hand in Lake Erie, covered with a green harmful algal bloom, algae, microcystin, that he then replicated in 2012. And he's got the same picture, side by side. So there were these harmful algal blooms that did exist. There's really a time on emerging science, developing analytical methods. There were very, very few analytical methods for sampling for wastewater treatment plants, or sampling for groundwater, or sampling for water quality, as well as developing our laboratory capabilities. And setting basic discharge limits, defining treatment technologies, and really doing this agronomic research. So these threats at the time, they were probably just as challenging as the newer challenges we see today. If we look a little bit back from this perspective, looking back, they seemed a little more manageable in my view, just because they seemed more visible. And then science could then apply some of the tools to figure out where they were coming from and what the solutions were going forward. So as I said, there were really two key pieces, and they interplayed quite well together. There's the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement and the Clean Water Act, excuse me. So in 1972 through 78, so this was not an instantaneous process, and it just definitely was not easy by any stretch. It didn't just happen overnight, but the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement was between the US and Canada, where we brought together these new emerging agencies on both sides of the border, and science and policymakers sat next to each other and really collaborated on developing and they came to consensus. And this is the real critical piece. This is how success happened here. They came to consensus around what are the sources of pollution, what are the solutions, what are the targets, how are we going to monitor, and what strategies are we going to put in place, in this case, to reduce phosphorus. And I'll talk a little bit more about phosphorus in the next slide. But what they came up with fit hand in glove with the new US Clean Water Act. What really set standards to regulate pollution coming from industrial and municipal point sources. What you don't see here is agriculture. And that is, and I will talk more about this as we get further on, agriculture is exempt almost 100% from the Clean Water Act. And so that doesn't pose a problem now when we're looking at these issues in the late 60s, 70s, and 80s on how to minimize phosphorus and the impacts that it has for pollution in Lake Erie. But it does become very relevant as we get into 2000s and beyond. Let me see here. So as I think about science informing policy between the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement and the Clean Water Act, if you just take one step back and remember I talked about it being the Great Lakes, Lake Erie being the most nutrient-rich lake, both a positive and a negative. When you think about all of that soup of nutrients that you have there, when scientists were looking to say, we've got this massive nutrient problem here, it's creating algal blooms, it's got other forms of issues with it. So what are we trying to do there? So what do we focus on? Is it nitrogen? Is it potassium? Is it phosphorus? Is it something else? You know, they did identify and agree that phosphorus was and should be limited to prevent algal growth in the lakes. It's the most limiting factor in terms of all the algal growth. And they then landed on this limit based on looking at historical trends of discharges of phosphorus into Lake Erie and corresponding algal bloom issues, set this limit on 11,000 metric tons per annum. Further, the science brought them in to say 70% of that phosphorus was coming at the time from municipal point sources. And they set a limit for wastewater treatment plant discharges of 1 milligram per liter for phosphorus. And here's where the hand fits in the glove. The Clean Water Act allowed EPA to enforce that limit on those point source dischargers. And so we then started on, you know, when I started at EPA in the early 90s, it had started in the late 80s, and we went through the 90s, where we went through massive funding campaigns to provide money to municipal wastewater treatment facilities to go from basic chlorinization and discharge, primary treatment, if anything, to up to and including where we are close to today, which is tertiary wastewater management, where in many cases, we're putting water back into our receiving bodies, whether it's a stream or whether it's a lake, from a municipal wastewater treatment that is quote unquote cleaner by many standards than the water that it's going back into. And so look at the result. By 1981, I've got a graph here I'm going to show you in a minute. 1981, phosphorus loads had fallen 60% and were below the 11,000 metric ton per annum. And you see the response there in terms of pollution in the lake. We redeclared Lake Erie undead in a very short number of years, based on the science informing policy and then policy getting put in place. Now, it wasn't easy, and you can think that just happened overnight, but it didn't. You know, we don't have somewhat of a recency bias here on how more difficult it's been recently than it was, but no doubt there were challenges at the policy level on how science and scientists were brought into and then had discussions and convinced policymakers that there were challenges, number one, and solutions that needed to be implemented. So I look at that, you know, Carl Sagan, it's like, oh my God, we quote unquote fixed it. Lake Erie went from dead to undead in a very short period of time. And I think a couple of points that I'll reiterate. One, you need a trigger. Why is that? You need this trigger. I think a number of factors, but you know, the final burning of the Cuyahoga River in '69 was that trigger. Other confluence of events around that really raised the awareness at policymakers levels, and then persistently pushed on policymakers to make some decisions on how to implement strategies to reduce the overall pollution loadings into Lake Erie, particularly around phosphorus, which was impacting the development of algal growth. Funding, I also mentioned wastewater treatment plants. As you recall, the amount of phosphorus going into the lake was well over the 11,000 metric tons. 70% of that was coming from municipal wastewater sources. It's a point source. Seems relatively easy. It's very expensive, but relatively easy to focus on that. You got an end of pipe, or you got pipes coming in for treatment. That's a little easier to fix that. So I think it was a huge challenge, and wouldn't take away anything from both either the scientists and or the implementers, policymakers, or the practitioners at the time. But I'll make the case that the threats were a little more visible, a little more gross, if you will, in terms of what needed to be taken care of. And then ultimately policymakers, science being able to inform the policymakers and the public demanding action to lead to that success. However, we learned some lessons here, and we've also forgotten a couple of things too. This is kind of small, so I say policymakers ultimately relied on science and scientists for the data to inform policies to fix Lake Erie the first time. 1980s led to the, I'd say it built an extensive monitoring networks. If I go across and then down, we built, this is probably one of the greatest things that they did, was to build the monitoring networks in the watershed and in the lake to understand natural cycles and the impacts of pollution so that you could track progress. And yes, the threats were more visible, but we needed to show and document and monitor that they were actually having success. Fortunately, we led to the decline in the 80s, but it also led to us forgetting and abandoning the programs that were helping us assist in the goals. Funding was drying up for treatment of wastewater treatment plants, but at the same time, we abandoned all the monitoring networks that we'd put in the watershed and in Lake Erie to continue to do monitoring, so that if we thought there was another problem emerging, that we would have a sentinel set of data out there to tell us if that was in fact coming. And frankly, once the problem was solved, policymakers moved on to another crisis and the public forgot. Largely, the large public generally forgot. And you would hope. So I'm going to make a transition here and say, geez, was that the end of it? If so, let's check the box for success and move on. But that's not nearly the case. If you look from the 1990s, early 1990s into the 2000s, so we had a small grace period here from the 80s, but really in the early 90s, we started to see some emerging new threats in Lake Erie beyond nutrients, which was again becoming a problem. But we had invasive species we'd always had. We had dead zones from nutrient enrichment, starting to see some emergence of climate change, coastal development and pressure on the coastal development resource, taking wetlands and other sources of environmental benefits out of the ecosystem, and then stormwater, wastewater discharges still presenting a problem. If you open the box a little more deeply on nutrients and nutrient management, you look at types and sources. This is where we'll talk about a dramatic change. Less point sources. Where was the nutrients coming from in the 90s and beyond? It was 70% of this was point sources. Now we're looking at much more agricultural predominant runoff for phosphorus and other nutrients. And then we're seeing an emergence, I call it, of a new villain, and we'll talk about this, of DRP, or dissolved reactive phosphorus, which was something that we knew about, but didn't know, the science didn't inform a whole lot about, because we were focused on, at the time, total particulate phosphorus, and both then leading again to a reemergence of algal blooms, including harmful algal blooms in the 1990s. So everybody remembers a couple of things in their life where they will never forget what happened. So here's my list. I was not alive for the Kennedy assassination, but I was for 9/11. I do remember my daughter Hannah being born, and I generally try to remember my anniversary. And I got married on the last day of the year, so it's generally pretty easy. But the one related to Lake Erie is Toledo, the Toledo drinking water quote unquote crisis. And needing to, on August 2nd, remember it clear as day, August 2nd, 2014 is a Friday. I remember leaving work, going home, walking in the door, and sometime around 9:45 getting a phone call from our lab talking about microcystin, elevated levels of microcystin in finished drinking water in Toledo, above a very outdated but still only standard we had at the time from the World Health Organization of 1 milligram per liter. And then we started the August 2nd, the 2nd, the 3rd, the 4th, where I basically had to, first call the governor, second, call the mayor of Toledo and say, you cannot supply drinking water to over 500,000 people. That extends into Michigan and well outside of the boundaries of Toledo. This, like the Cuyahoga fire, there's a whole other thing we could talk about on Toledo drinking water in particular that we won't today, but this was a trigger. This was much like the Cuyahoga River burning. And I'm going to show you a couple of graphics here as to why this was a trigger. And there was a lot of science that had been screaming at us for probably 10 years or so to get our attention as policymakers to say there is a new problem coming. So this graph is around total phosphorus loadings into Lake Erie. You can see from the 67 into the late 80s, the impact that we were seeing on policy changes and investments in bringing phosphorus levels down in the lake. Very noticeable. You can see we had, you know, a slight grace period, but from 87 to 2007, the trends, if it's present at all, is really that less uncertain. If you run this forward from 2007 and beyond, you'll starting the phosphorus loading increase particularly heavy. And if I go to the next slide, we'll talk about this new villain emerging of dissolved reactive phosphorus. So think of total phosphorus as just a mix-up of different types. So you get particulate phosphorus and DRP, dissolved reactive phosphorus. You look at dissolved reactive phosphorus numbers, 75 through the 90s, we're actually going down on a trend line from 1995 and beyond, going up very steeply. There's some really interesting things about why that is that frankly, we still don't know. What are those triggers? What happened that made dissolved reactive phosphorus become much more of a concern when we overall saw total phosphorus numbers decline and then stay relatively steady during the same particular time period? You know, there's lots of speculation, and this is where sometimes policymakers and or influencers of policymakers that would like to see policies not change use all kinds of things to distract from the real science. So there's a lot of science trying to figure out, what is this? Why is it? Why are we seeing this dissolved reactive phosphorus? And it still is ongoing. We don't know exactly why, but there are some reasons for it. The real critical piece here is total phosphorus and particulate phosphorus when it makes its way into the lake. It has a bioavailability quotient of about 20%. Conversely, if you turn around and you think about dissolved reactive phosphorus, it's virtually 100%. It's just absolutely waiting for that, for those algae to come along and be really efficient in processing that phosphorus and growing. And so we're dealing with several orders of magnitude more proficient source of food for the algae. And it became a real issue. So we've got lots of researchers here. I've talked about Dr. Reuter, who's the director of Stone Lab for a number of years, and his follow-on director of Chris Winslow. There's Laura Johnson at Heidelberg, Tom Bridgman at Toledo, Rick Stumpf at NOAA, and a whole other cast of other folks that dedicate their entire life to studying Lake Erie and the science behind it. One of the other critical pieces that they came up with in terms of revelations here that science is going to help inform policy is this graph here, and it's pretty instructive. Now, this is talking about bloom severity. So when we see, since we know these algal blooms are coming, we're trying to predict how significant they're going to be for the following year. What I'm showing you here is you see the really significant spikes and drops in 11 and 12, and then again in 15 and 16. This is where we see the research going on, particularly by Laura Johnson at Heidelberg, seeing that there's a strong algal bloom response to annual variations in runoff, and they've gone even further to say it's spring runoff. So that March, April, May, and June time period, if you have significant rainfall within the Lake Erie watershed and the Western Basin, you'll see a significant increase in dissolved reactive phosphorus, like we showed you, and then you'll see a particularly increased elevated response in terms of algal blooms. So you see that from 2010 to 2011, I didn't put the graph in here, but I could run a line through this and show you that spring rains during that time period were very significant. It brought a 2011 response, and then again in 2014, and the response in 2015. So you can see the science starting to hone in here to say, we've got this new problem emerging, and people were trying to get policymakers' attention on this. In fact, we weren't paying attention as much as we should have. This is a graph I'll show you. It talks about the change in sources of phosphorus. If you remember, we were at 70% for industrial point sources. We're now at about 7%. And farm fertilizers and manure application is well over 85%. And in some smaller watersheds, it's virtually 95 or higher. This is just a series of colorized satellite images from 2002 through 2014 of harmful algal blooms in Lake Erie. And you can see when we had the most severe years. This depends on currents in the lake, as well as a lot of atmospheric wind, how wind influences algae on the surface of the lake. But overall, you can really get a sense some years are bad, some years are good, some years are really bad. in some years, but never is it completely gone. And there are still a lot of research going on to figure out why exactly is that? Because in some cases, we will see a significant phosphorus loading into the lake and still see a lower than expected bloom response, of which they're not completely certain as to why. So anyway, early policy response here was Grand Lake. I was talking about Grand Lake St. Mary's in 2010. It was the first time that I had, as a policymaker, been introduced to this. 2010, Grand Lake St. Mary's is the largest inland lake in the state of Ohio, just outside of the Lake Erie Basin, where in 2010 we had an algal bloom there that was so significant that we basically had to close down the lake. It's a state park, and the water was so thick with algae that you could barely get a boat through it. There was localized intense outcry, and it was important, but it was regional. And so that demand for action, as I talk about, a trigger for a larger response at the statewide level or national level, just wasn't there. But we did some important things. We did a call, Watershed in Distress, developed a nutrient strategy, and provided some money to assist farmers. Here, the stressor on the lake for phosphorus inputs was very well known. It's a very small watershed around the lake, and it was manure from combined animal feeding operations. So we knew how to invest money to help them manage their manure, get it off site, get it out of the watershed. And there was a very other things that we did there, dredging the lake, pulling rough fish, they call them, suckers and other things off the bottom, so you won't have a resurgence of phosphorus off the lake and re-energize that. So we put that strategy together through this nutrient reduction strategy quickly. And if you go to Grand Lake St. Mary's today, still in progress, but a very important positive response to that ecosystem as well. But again, it was really an adaptive process. We didn't know anything about it until we started really to understand and talk to the scientists about what was happening in Grand Lake St. Mary's. So post-Toledo as a trigger really intensified the events because it was international, grabbed the attention of policymakers and science to really come together to, like they did under the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. The most, I think, important piece here was the Phosphorus Task Force that was put together by the state of Ohio, committing to loading 40% less phosphorus in Lake Erie from 2008. 2008 was a really wet year, and we had a lot of loading into the lake. We said if we actually met that 40% reduction from that number, would give us a safety factor or a cushion to be able to meet that. And at that point, it was just, okay, it was a task force recommendation. It didn't have any teeth to it. Governor Kasich at the time said, I want to work with Governor Snyder at the time and the Premier of Ontario to actually sign a document. So we created something called the Collaborative Agreement. We said we'd reach this 40% reduction by 2025 with the goal to get 20% by 2020, which also led to some continued work in the General Assembly and the policymakers. Everybody, the public was demanding action. And there were a lot of legislation pieces discussed. We did pass some in 2015, and we also failed in 2018. I'll talk about those here in a second. 2015 was important in that we did some important things. We said for fertilizer and manure, you cannot apply it on frozen or saturated soils. I couldn't believe that we were actually applying it on saturated or frozen soils, but farmers have always been, in this case, been allowed to, so they would. And they planned for the amount of capacity that they had for managing manure based on this practice, that they could still go out in the winter on frozen ground, which in my view has always been tantamount to disposal, not fertilizer, and putting frozen manure or fertilizer on the frozen ground or when it was even saturated. So we said you can't do that. Second, there's some training. It's called the 4R training. When they came in to get their pesticide certification, Department of Ag also ran them through a course called the 4Rs, which is actually important. It's training about doing soil testing and applying the right amount of fertilizer at the right place and at the right time. And we even looked back and said, wastewater treatment plants are very effective here, but they still had some that weren't meeting that 1 milligram per liter. So we mandated that happen if they were not. What you don't see is we also brought a consortium of researchers together led by the Ohio State University, but included a lot of universities across the state that wanted to get in the game here and do research. And we said, we will fund this research, but you have to be able to produce results in 2 years and then be able to share that information publicly so it could be part of our overall policy response. That program still continues. It's one of the greatest success stories, I think, in terms of bringing policy policy makers as well as scientists together, not having them compete with each other, but actually work together, collaborate on the science that they're working on, and come up with answers really quickly. So the 2018 legislative effort was the quote unquote failure, if you will. We did expand the definition of agricultural pollution to include fertilizer, but we wanted to. That was not part of the definition in the state of Ohio. We were trying to direct the Department of Agriculture to establish rules for what is called a watershed in distress. Watersheds in distress, excuse me, is the tool that we used in Grand Lake St. Mary's. It is a function of the Department of Agriculture and the Soil and Water Commission, which is a commission appointed by the governor. You know, it's not a governor's declaration that there is a watershed in distress, but it is through the Soil and Water Commission. We worked very hard with the General Assembly and leadership, and they refused to pass the bill. The governor said, okay, I'll write an executive order and I'll declare that the Department of Agriculture needs to write rules for what agricultural pollution and watersheds in distress are, and to require, once that happens, enforceable mandates in these watersheds for all of those watersheds to meet the 40% reduction loading targets. And that set up what I call the brutal fight and failure, which has led to a new path. You know, the failure was we took this issue to the Soil and Water Commission, again, appointed by the governor, and said the governor has an executive order, but the Soil and Water Commission needs to make these determinations, the declaration of the entire Western Basin that it needs to be under these plans, these mandatory plans for meeting the 40% goal. And this all played out from July to November 2018. At the end of that day, it came down to a final vote on November 1st, 2018. Soil and Water Commission, the Soil and Water Commission failed to take that vote, or they took the vote and it failed by one vote, and which basically killed the statewide effort to come up with a more regulatory response. Because while we were seeing some progress, we were not seeing progress fast enough to get us to the 2025 goal. And so, you know, as things changed, and so did administrations, Governor DeWine came in and learned a lot from the successes and failures that we had, and said, we're going to create this H2 Ohio program. H2 Ohio really has some targeted priorities across the spectrum around reducing phosphorus and looking at lead piping and drinking water and EPA, but it's really bringing EPA, DNR, and the Department of Ag together to work on these from the soil perspective and fertilizer perspective on reducing phosphorus. They're providing economic incentives. So it's continuing with voluntary programs and to do soil testing, cover crops, manage runoff, and improve fertilizer application. I think it remains to be seen if that is effective, or frankly, is there at some point, the concerns of some policymakers and some in the public is to say, at some point, voluntary programs will only take you so far. And that to bring in the last remaining very critical percentage of adopters in these programs, you're going to have to apply some regulatory drivers to get some in the agricultural community to do this. That's where we were working and trying to get to that point through the Soil and Water Commission. And Governor DeWine's taken a slightly different path. Not only wants to rely on voluntary programs, but has set up a funding program to do that. So they think they're investing like $170 million in the first wave. They've asked to basically double that in the next budget to encourage voluntary participation, which I'm not against. Absolutely, and if it works, I think that would be great. Although I think history will tell us that voluntary programs are only going to get us so far. And at some point, because either from the federal level or just at the state level, we're going to have to be able to monitor this and see if we're being effective. And if we're not, go back to this point and see that there is a day of reckoning. Now, the governor's been clear, and he told the ag industry this: we will try this. And if we do not have the participation that we need, you'll leave me with no other choice to get me down this regulatory pathway. But I think that the success of the programs, it's early, as well as implementation, participation by farmers, all remains to be seen. So I think this is are we making progress and are we being effective? I think we've made some progress and we're being fairly effective. Are we going to get there through these voluntary programs? That remains yet to be seen. And I think everybody's watching, including the governor, to see if that is in fact going to happen. So final thought wise, I thought I would finish up and just, Lake Erie is just a cool place. If you either, get a chance to visit its shores or get out on its water. I'm a kid from Pennsylvania and I grew up in the woods of Pennsylvania and then down in Southeast Ohio. Prior to being director at Ohio EPA, I think I'd been to Lake Erie twice, but I've really fallen in love with it like many people do. So is it and will it remain a crown jewel of Ohio? Yes. She's resilient and so are we, but there are a lot of threats, not just issue about harmful algal blooms, but everything from that we talked about in one of the previous slides, everything from invasives to climate change to pressures from industrialization, urbanizations. There's threats and there's new ones. Old and new that are coming, and that's where really the scientists can be that can really be able to elevate those issues when we need to. We need to invest in the long term for funding. Right now, Great Lakes funding, Lake Erie funding happens on an annual biannual basis, either with the states and Congress. There's no long-term funding that really supports the scientific baseline that you need to be able to find those emerging problems and then act on them in a systemic way. Always a tough issue. How do you capture policymakers' attention when there isn't a crisis, and then start formulating policy to stop the crisis? And that's always a challenge. It's this incremental communication, adaptive process. There's a lot of good research out there that I've been reading over the last years. Is how do you take a scientist and sit them down with a policymaker and not have them speaking two different languages and talking past each other and informing each other? And so I think there's a lot of opportunities for that. And then at last, I say we're nearing this reckoning as to whether we're making a difference where we need to be by 2025 and beyond with these programs to reduce phosphorus and protect ultimately not only the ecosystem and the watershed, but drinking water for roughly about 11 million people. So thank you. And Mackenzie, I'll hand it back to you.
Thanks so much, Craig. We have some questions in the chat for the last 5 minutes. I really appreciate that presentation. And I know that resonated with a lot of folks that are in this group that are, how do we speak that language to policymakers and deal with these challenges? But I have a question here from John Bourne in the chat. He wants to know, can you speak about the importance of collaboration in the successful resolution of the 2014 Toledo water crisis?
Absolutely. So one of my favorite stories is in fact that collaboration. So, was I the person that had to pick up the phone and call the governor and then call the mayor that you can't serve water because it's contaminated? Absolutely. But it was a absolute all hands on deck. You walk into the emergency operations center that John is familiar with in the state of Ohio, and it's probably one of the best in the country, where you can talk to virtually anybody in the state from an emergency management standpoint or a political or environmental policy standpoint. And so, it is the system that the state of Ohio has is ultimately very, very effective. But, from the time that we made that declaration, we engaged the National Guard, we engaged our Guard, we engaged all our agencies across the board to basically say, how do you manage this? This was a national level crisis, within the state of Ohio, getting national attention. So you needed people with very important specialties, the people that would deal with the science end of this. We had a whole group there. We had the whole people that were doing the communications outside to be able to talk to the general public about informing them of what the problem was, how we were working to effectively put a system or a fix in place so that we could provide them safe drinking water. How do we get the results? And then be able to communicate that in a way that people were willing to accept and understand and trust. So, when we mobilized, thousands of people across all of the state and federal government, really, with John's leadership, as well as Governor Kasich's leadership, to say, whatever you need, we'll figure out how to get it. But because I'll also mention, the operations center and emergency management, they practice for these things, so they can, a policymaker like me doesn't practice this. They can lead us through the methodical process of dealing with a crisis like this, take out some of the emotion, and then use the infrastructure and architecture that has been built within the state to manage it, whether it's a water crisis or some other national or some other disaster within the state. So it really is invaluable. And ultimately, it led us to come up with a faster, quicker, better result in a few days, and to be able to reassure Toledoans that their water was in fact safe to drink.
Thank you, Greg. I'm going to move on to a question from an environmental studies student, Daniel here. He's asking, what early warning systems do you think would be most effective for engaging with policymakers prior to crisis?
You know, a couple of examples on, you know, sometimes the things just come out of the blue, but generally not. So on the Lake Erie's perspective, there is now, you know, the NOAA administration is looking at satellite information on a daily basis. And so we're looking at algal blooms. We know when they generally happen in the spring through the summer and the fall. You know, so there are early warning systems there at a very short time span that can inform us when we think we're going to have a problem. There's also massive amounts of water quality sampling, both remote through some new satellite technologies and remote sensing, but also just boots on the ground, or at least, you know, boots in the boat, getting out, taking water samples. And so those are great short-term factors that we look at to see if in a matter of days or weeks that we may have a problem. You know, stretching the lens a little bit, thinking about what are some of the, you know, larger scientific discoveries here that you could look in Lake Erie. We've got to continue to look in the interaction between dissolved reactive phosphorus. As I mentioned, sometimes we get a large algal bloom because we've had a lot of phosphorus brought into the lake from brainstorm. But we have a subdued or muted harmful algal bloom response, or we may have an algal bloom response is really high, but the toxicity of that algal bloom is fairly low, and so understanding the dynamics there is really, really important. And we don't know that. You know, nitrogen can be a limiting factor in many cases, but there's still a lot of unknowns about how all of that chemistry works and how it impacts whether we've got a toxic bloom, a non-toxic bloom, or we have a bloom at all. So that's important research to continue. You know, just overall, I think it's, I would say it can be, you know, think about, you got to understand, if you're a scientist, you have to understand how a policy person works, whether it's in an agency or an elected official, and really find ways to make early relationships with them. So one, that they believe that you're an expert in your field. Two, that you're a trusted source of information when they get questions, that they can turn to you and say, I need independent information. I've got lobbyists and I've got people knocking on my door trying to sell me something in some way, shape, or form. I've got an opinion, I've got a position, I want you to take my position. The one thing when you're, you know, work in the policy world, the thing that you yearn for the most is, where can I find a third-party independent source that would be universally trusted and accepted to give me information so I can shape policy. So if you can figure out how to do that by building relationships with those policy people before it comes a crisis, you have a much better chance for success.
That's a great recommendation. Thanks, Craig. I realize it's 1 o'clock. We still have some folks here. Do you have time for one more question?
Sure.
So before we go, I have a question from Mike here. He says, in your current role, what collaboration are you seeing to protect the water quality from agriculture, the oil and gas industry, and other industrial sources? Do you feel the state's water quality monitoring efforts are sufficient to detect changes in water quality?
Wow, we got a whole nother hour there. I would say this, you know, the Muskingum Watershed Conservancy is, you know, it's a three-legged stool. It's as much about recreation. We've got, you know, large reservoirs, we've got camping, we've got recreation on the water. Recreation is one. Flood control is the main mission here, in providing, you know, like $11 billion worth of flood control to the Muskingum Valley. The third leg of that stool is conservation. We are continuing to build relationships with soil and water conservation districts, with the Department of Agriculture. We invest, you know, about $5 million a year in programs that go directly out into the agricultural community to do exactly what I talked about, this 4R program, as well as doing nutrient management plans, do cover crops within the watershed to help improve water quality, which is our most precious asset once it gets either for drinking water into our lakes and reservoirs. Do I think the state system is robust enough to look for impairment? It can always be greater, but Ohio is one of the most, has one of the most significant and most robust water quality programs in the country. There are programs that the entire country uses that the state of Ohio has developed throughout the 70s and 80s around how to look at impairments in water quality. So Ohio has always been, and I think will always remain, one of the places where everybody looks to for water quality monitoring to identify impairments so you can come up with a solution to fix it.
Thanks, Craig. And I told you when I first emailed you, I probably should have carved out more than an hour. These are typically an hour. I knew we had a lot of stuff to cover. But thank you so much for the presentation today, answering all of our questions that we had time for. I want to echo Jay Johnson's thanks in the chat. Thank you for your adaptive leadership and taking care of our environment here in Ohio. For those of you that are still on, I do want to remind you we have a session upcoming on March 31st with 3 Voinovich students, and hope to see you all there. Thank you. Thank you again, Craig.
One last thing, I would just tell everybody to seek a career in public service. It'll do you well, and you'll get a lot of great value for it.
Thank you.
Yep. Take care.
Thanks so
Thanks,
much, Craig.
guys.
You're welcome.
Happy St.
Take care.
Patty's Day. Enjoy the rest of your week.
Yeah, Craig.
See you soon.
Great job.